Calling all listeners, we need you to join our dialogue on health in Maine. We're ending the year with an icy dive into the oceans. Our relationship to nature defines who we are and will have profound impacts on future generations. The case for our interrelationship with nature is manifest in our long historic connection to the sea. Many of our misdeeds have been absorbed by these vast bodies of water, but the tide has turned, and in many ways we've gone beyond the capacity of the oceans to absorb our waste. Join us now for a dialogue about healthy oceans and healthy communities. We invite your calls and email with questions and comments. You can call in anytime during the show locally at 469-0500 or toll free at 866-625-9378. We have one guest on the phone today, so if you call and get a busy signal, just call back a little later. It's just one open line for callers to come in, but we do want you to join the dialogue. With that said, I'm joined today in the studio by Dr. Jane Disney, who's director of the Community Environmental Health Laboratory at the Mount Desert Biological Laboratory. Good morning, Jane.
Hi.
And on the telephone, I hope, is Dr. Susan Shaw, President and CEO of Marine Environmental Research Institute. Are you there, Jane?
I'm certainly here.
Jane's here.
Susan. I'm here.
You're there. We're here. And I'd like to give you each a chance to tell the listeners a little bit about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and a little bit about your organizations. Why don't I start with you, Susan? Tell us a little bit about Marine Environmental Research Institute, but maybe about yourself first. How did you come to directing this important environmental organization?
Well, just to start, I'm a marine toxicologist. I'm trained in toxicology and ecotoxicology, which is toxicology in the environment. And I've been studying the impacts of toxic chemicals in the ocean environment for about 20 years, a little bit more. And how I came to this, to make a long story short, when I was a graduate student, I was in the School of Public Health at Columbia University in Environmental Health Sciences, and I had formerly been a filmmaker and a communicator. I went back to get a graduate degree in public health and toxicology, and I was contacted by Ansel Adams, who asked me to write a book with him, and the book came out like in 1983. It was called Overexposure, and it was the first book to look at the chemicals that photographers use in the darkroom, and so it was a human exposure book. And then from that, I was doing my graduate project and for my doctorate at Columbia, and during a summer, I was in Maine, and I heard about this massive seal die-off in northwestern Europe in 1988. And that really got my attention because they were finding high levels of PCBs and other toxic chemicals in the tissues of these animals that died of a virus that they should have been able to ward off. So that became my project, was studying animals at the top of the marine food web and the buildup of chemicals in their bodies, which cause them to be less resilient to disease. And I've been doing that work. It's called, we call it sentinel species studies. So I've been doing that work for over 20 years now. The work has broadened considerably, and I founded the Marine Environmental Research Institute around 1990, so we're about 22, going on 23. It's a 23-year-old institution. And we've produced a body of work based on the sentinels of the Gulf of Maine. So those are the harbor seals, the most plentiful pinniped population we have. We've been measuring hundreds and hundreds of chemicals in their tissues for over a decade now. And I've been quite alarmed at the trends in the rising toxicity. So I'd like to talk more about that, but as we go into the program, because we're not only finding the industrial chemicals, PCBs, the pesticides, the DDT, those chemicals have been banned for 20 years, but they're so persistent that we're still finding very, very high levels when you look at animals at the top of the food web. And we're really talking about animals that spend half their lives in the Gulf of Maine, so at least. And the other thing I wanted to say at the outset was that now what we are alarmed about is finding the chemicals we use in our everyday lives in the tissues of these animals, like the flame retardants in our furniture. The trends are not good, and it's important that people, know about this and find ways to change behavior so that this doesn't get worse.
Well, great. I want to give Jane a chance to talk a little bit about. Jane, how did you come into working in Maine? In Maine in the MDI biological labs, and you're really in an educator role, which I find fascinating. But how did you get started in this field of marine biology?
Well, my background's actually in salmonid evolution, so I've long had an interest in organisms that inhabit our waters, both fresh and marine.
So you played in tide pools as a child?
Actually, I didn't play in tide pools as a child. Yeah, I was more like the stream and river kind of gal. But since moving to Maine and getting involved with the Maine Shore Stewards Program through the Maine State Planning Office 20 years ago, and having transitioned from science to education about 20 years ago, I've been including kids and teachers and citizens of all ages in looking at water quality and all of the issues that surround that. So over the years, I've transitioned back from education into research at the MDI Biological Laboratory, which is an institution that has a long history of using marine organisms to study a variety of different biological questions, including biomedical questions. So right now, the BioLab is interested in this relationship between the environment and human health, and hence my position there. So in my role as staff scientist and director of the Community Environmental Health Laboratory, I continue to be involved in education, but I also have a research program in which I'm looking at water quality and different marine habitats, including eelgrass.
Yeah, I was going to say that in my meetings with you, eelgrass has come up more than once. And why is eelgrass important?
Well, eelgrass is a habitat that supports a lot of life in the bay. And so now we're talking at the bottom of the food chain. And it's a place where a lot of small invertebrates can be found that are a food source for larger invertebrates and fishes. Small fish find refuge there from predators, and you'll find a lot of juvenile species there growing up. It functions as a nursery. But in addition to that, eelgrass can take excess nutrients out of the water that come into the ocean through runoff. It can help to mitigate the effects of wave action on the shore and actually prevent shoreline erosion, which can lead back to sedimentation in the water. Sediments will settle out around eelgrass, so it plays the dual biological and physical role there in the estuaries of bays. And in Frenchman Bay, where I work in particular, over the last decade and a half, we've lost 75% of this habitat. And so seagrasses are being lost worldwide for a lot of reasons. And again, it's an indication that our oceans aren't healthy.
Do we know the cause of the loss of the habitat? Is it development, or is it chemical changes in the water?
It depends on where you are. There's a lot of things that can lead to loss, but we pollute in a lot of areas. It's eutrophication, so it's runoff into the oceans and excess nitrogen and phosphorus, more than the plants can handle. And so then we get algal blooms, and we lose the sunlight that the plants need. And so pollution's a problem, physical disturbances, sometimes through severe storms. So as we have more severe storms, that isn't good for seagrass habitats, but also physical disturbances from dredging and dragging can be an issue, as well as invasive species that can disrupt the eelgrass. So on and on. There's a lot of things.
And they're all connected.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued. Both Susan and Jane, both of you have and particularly Susan, you began with an MFA, a Master's of Fine Arts, or that wasn't your beginning, but you were in arts and film. And you went from trying to tell the story to trying to understand it better, I guess, and then tell it from a new perspective. And it sounds like, Jane, you're kind of working from that same angle, that at some point you want to dive deeper into the data in order to understand what's going on.
Mm-hmm. And include as many people as possible, because our mission at the Community Environmental Health Laboratory is to educate people by including people in the data collection process. So citizen science is a lot of what we're involved in.
Well, we're going to have to talk about that, but I want to remind listeners this is a dialogue. You're welcome to join us at any time. We're talking about healthy oceans today, and you can call locally at 469-0500 or toll free at 866-625-9378. So, Susan, back to you a minute. I kind of in an almost ridiculously big question on a very big topic, but what's the state of the oceans right now? And we can think locally about Gulf of Maine or even Blue Hill Bay, but what kind of trends are we seeing?
Well, I think overall, in a global picture way, the oceans are in crisis. We have known this for the last, I'd say, 5 years. The crisis has been worsening, and this is there's consensus among scientists internationally. There's so many signs of this. Jane mentioned some of those that her organization's looking at, and but they include warming, acidification, eutrophication. There's over 500 dead zones worldwide, which are anoxic waters. They support no life whatsoever. One of the large ones in the United States is the Gulf of Mexico, and the oceans are really taking it hard. We have combination of warming and pollution and plastics. So warming, of course, relates to the use of the overuse of fossil fuels and a reliance on those, and the massive release of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere that's coming down into the oceans, and the changes in the temperatures are making all this worse. So what we're looking at are cumulative impacts. We have rising toxicity, we have warming and shift of food webs and across all the world's oceans, and we have and then the oceans becoming more acid, so that animals which have shells, forming shells like clams. We have this right in southern Maine. The mud is getting so toxic and so acid that larval clams cannot form their shells, and this does apply to all the oceans of the world. And I think, from my point of view, what I've been looking at is the release of billions of tons of toxic materials that people use now. We're using so many chemicals. There's 84,000 chemicals on the market, and none of those have really been tested. Many of them are linked with health effects in marine life and in humans. So our institute, the Marine Environmental Research Institute, is part of our mission to protecting ocean life and human health, and we're very much looking at the connection between those two.
Well, doesn't sound good. Jane, you want to add something? You're looking specifically, and you've talked a little bit about loss of habitat in eelgrass. Do you have a sense of what will happen in this area if we don't intervene?
Well, I think, we've lost a lot of fisheries in the Gulf of Maine, and even in our bay, we're down to four main species that
Lobsters,
support
mussels, clams,
and worms. Yeah, and that's all we have there at the bottom of the food chain that supports local fishing families and our local economy. So I have been working with a group of stakeholders around Frenchman Bay to look at some of the most impacted habitats and species and try to begin a discussion of how we set goals to minimize threats to these habitats and species, and what we can do to locally try to make a difference. Because unless we do intervene, I think we'll just continue to have habitat loss, and we'll probably even narrow down even more the number of species that are supporting fishing families and the fishing community.
Is that your conclusion, Susan, as well? That the current course will just continue, or if we don't take pretty radical steps?
Yeah, without a doubt. I think we have to do something. It's been agreed, globally, we have less than 10 years to intervene and to do something to stop the current trends. And I would say, if you're looking at the top of the food chain, just as indicators, the sentinel species, marine mammals, they're predicted to go, a third of marine mammal populations are predicted to go extinct by 2050, and that's a lot of loss of animals. And
can you name some of those that are in that category?
Well, polar bears would be an obvious
one. Yeah, right.
But also our seal populations are not doing well. There's a continuing repeated die-offs of these animals, like the dolphins off of Cape Cod. There was a big die-off last spring, and hundreds of animals die. But these die-offs are not isolated events. They're recurring events worldwide, and they're increasing. We see them in seals, particularly, and in little coastal dolphins that are feeding in the more contaminated areas of the ocean. So when we have animals wash up on our beaches, animals that strand and die on our beaches in one of those die-off events, the tissues literally contain so many toxic chemicals, and the levels are so high for PCBs alone that they're considered hazardous waste.
So I guess what we're talking about is kind of an accumulation, a bioaccumulation of toxics that it starts, I guess, maybe in fairly low levels in the eelgrasses or the phytoplanktons, and then it increases. How does that process work? Why does it become more concentrated in these sentinel species?
Because they're feeding at the top of a food web, and the chemicals themselves, like the flame retardants, the PCBs, and the pesticides, are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. So as one animal at one trophic level will eat its prey, it picks up a certain amount of these chemicals, and then the levels build up exponentially as you move up the food web. So we've been measuring levels of the flame retardants in fish in the Gulf of Maine. We looked at 7 species of commercially important fish like hake and flounder and plaice and herring and mackerel. And the levels, we're finding rather surprising levels of these chemicals that we use in our fish. And then from fish to, say, the harbor seal or to a dolphin, you have a biomagnification of, you can have a biomagnification of something like almost 100 times.
So the chemical, when the animal, say a dolphin eats a smaller fish and it gets a little bit of the flame retardant that the smaller fish had, does it get stored in the fat or in the liver or some tissue like that?
We've been looking at that. Did a recent study of the tissue accumulation of these compounds, and some of the compounds do migrate to the liver because they are hanging on to, they attach themselves to proteins in the blood. So the liver is very rich in blood, as you know. So some of those compounds we find heavily concentrated in the liver, and other ones are stored in the blubber, in the fat, and that's fatty tissue of a fish to the fatty tissue in a sea animal. So it depends on the chemical where it winds up, but the point is that once the chemicals are so persistent, once it gets into the body, animals and people cannot metabolize the chemicals. So chemicals like flame retardants and PCBs will stay in the body for decades.
Yeah, and so that happens to us too then when we eat the fish.
That's right.
Which is an important connection to make, I think, for listeners. And I do want to encourage listeners also to join in. I've got lots of questions, but I bet yours are better. So you can call locally at 469-0500 or toll free at 866-625-9378. Jane, are you looking at, in your studies, are you looking at the land end of things, how these chemicals are getting into the environment and how this harm is being done?
Well, we haven't been particularly looking at toxics, at runoff in general.
Runoff in general.
Yep. And so non-point source pollution that comes in from everywhere has been for a long time a problem along our coastlines. And this is where we get excess nutrients coming in, probably toxics we haven't even identified. And it's hard to even assess the impact that this is having on all of what's going on in the ocean, because there's just so many directions that stressors are coming from. But I can tell you that with regard to the runoff that's nutrient rich, this can also have an effect on ocean acidification, something people don't realize. So it's not just excess CO2 in the atmosphere, but also from nutrients running in and causing
interesting
algal blooms.
Well, we do have our first caller, and I want to get you on. If you give us your first name and where you're calling from.
Good morning. This is Yo in Tremont. I was in environmental studies in the university 40 years ago, and all this stuff was our subject matter. None of this is new. And the 10-year crisis deadline was still the 10-year crisis deadline in those days. And given the apparent resolution of the global industrial complex to make and spill as much toxic stuff as possible, and given the persistence of these chemicals in the waters and in the tissues of the biomass, is there really any reason to think that any kind of intervention whatsoever would be possible or effective? Thank you so much for putting on this program, and thank you to everyone for supporting community radio.
Well, Yo goes right to the critical question, I guess, is, and we'll be talking more about this in the latter part of the show, but is it too late, Susan?
I think it's not too late, and I think it may have been, there may have been, I understand that point about 40 years ago, but I think we're at a much more critical point now with these impacts that are accumulating and getting worse and worse. But I would say to the question of is it too late, there's so many things that people can do now, and where one of which is we need legislation to protect us from exposure to toxics. We do not have that currently, and this is one of the reasons, going back 40 years, why we're in the situation we're in now, is because our federal law, the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976, is so weak. There are so many loopholes in it that the EPA cannot regulate chemicals. We have a failure of regulation in this country. But in Sweden, where there's a more of a proactive, protective approach, cautionary approach. Some of the flame retardants were banned early in the 1990s, and the levels have gone down precipitously in humans and in marine animals. So I think if we can get legislative control, we can do a lot. So people can become involved with that. That's only one of about 4 action things that we can all do. And another one is becoming informed. The public needs to know what it is and what we are exposed to and what's going into our oceans. Secondly, sharing that information with friends and on social media, and getting other people involved and becoming actively involved with groups like ours and Jane's who are for example, we're launching a campaign now called STOP, STOP, Stop Toxic Ocean Pollution. We're launching that campaign in 2013, and that's a way people can become involved.
Great. Jane, do you want to add, is it too late? You've been looking at Frenchman Bay in particular, and things aren't terrible there yet. It sounds like there's still a lot of room for improvement.
There is. I mean, we have fairly good water quality by the standards that we measure in terms of nitrogen, phosphorus levels. And, we don't really see changing salinities or marked changes in temperature that would indicate this is why we don't have fish like we used to. I mean, so there's a lot that we do in addition to polluting our environment and using too much carbon, but including overfishing, taking too much and not leaving enough for a healthy ecosystem.
Dare we say also the way we're fishing? Dragging is a controversial issue.
Yeah, we also have some fishing methodologies that are very hard on populations of fishes and also can be destructive to the benthic environment and to other organisms in other environments. So I feel like we can look at those things as communities, or we can look at it on a multi-municipal level, or we can look at it on a state level and start to make our own decisions about what we think needs to change and take action. I think on the municipal level, we need to look at our comprehensive plans and develop them where we don't have them, but also thinking about what can be done to mitigate runoff in the way we develop, the way we build, the way we put roads in. It just doesn't seem conscionable that we're putting in, Route 3 there onto MDI and all the sediments washing down into the Jordan River, for example.
Great. Well, we have another caller. So if you give us your first name and where you're calling from, you can join the dialogue.
Yeah, my name is David. I'm calling from Lincolnville. And I just have a quick question. I think this is a really fantastic subject to be discussing at this time. But my question is what are your views on commercial kelp harvesting and what kind of an impact that might have on the ecosystems along our coastline here? So if you could kind of give me some kind of an insight on that, I'd be very grateful. Thanks.
Well, Jane, have you got any thoughts on commercial kelp harvesting? It's certainly become an issue lately.
It has. Yeah. And I know that there are people working on these issues in the state of Maine. I attended one workshop up at University of Maine on harvesting macroalgae. And there's debate about, where, how close to cut and how much to take. And I'd like to think that we can bring some good science to bear on harvesting of seaweeds in general, and find a way to limit the impact on the environment, but still find a way to support local economies. So I think that everything in moderation. I mean, just everything in this world.
Susan, do you have any ideas? Is this question resonating with you?
Well, actually, not so much. I haven't been following that. The impact that commercial harvesting is having, except for, I guess, the shellfish aquaculture that's proliferating, at least in our area. We are watching that because that seems to be something that's, increasing around here. There's more leasing for oyster and mussel beds, and I don't think that you haven't mentioned this, but we do have a local monitoring program in Blue Hill Bay. We monitor about 40 sites for water quality here, and also we're looking at nutrients and warming and some of the things that Jane's talking about.
Yeah.
And along the lines of aquaculture, there's certainly some places along the Atlantic coast where people are delving into kelp aquaculture and meeting with some success. And maybe, this would be a way to eliminate the effects on natural populations by looking at ways to grow kelp through an aquaculture process. So maybe that can be, sometimes aquaculture can seem problematic in a bay, but sometimes it can be the solution to other problems in a bay.
Well, I certainly reflect on the history of fishing in Maine, and ocean production has been one of a cycle of sort of pillage and burn and then long recovery periods. And so with the groundfish, the cod and the haddock, and with sea urchins and other species like that, we've tended to go in scallops, I guess mussels and clams. We tend to go in a little without a sustainable framework in mind. And now it appears to be happening with kelp as well, that there's a market. And we don't have a lot of other employment right now offering, with the collapse of other fisheries and the high cost of getting into lobstering, that people are looking for work, and harvesting kelp and processing it has become another alternative. But how do we do that sustainably? And I think that's the question David's asking.
That's right. And of course, it's something we need to look at, but not one that I have an answer for.
I was curious, Susan, from your perspective, if these sea vegetables are also picking up the toxics that you're worried about, and is this something we should be concerned about in our food supply?
Well, there's some evidence that they are. We're starting to look at that. We are going to be looking at sediments and some of the animals at the bottom of the food web in Blue Hill Bay and possibly in Penobscot Bay as well. And our focus has been so intensive at the top of the food web, going down to fairly large predator fish, and that's where we're mostly seeing the buildup. But of course, it's flowing through the entire food web. If we're finding detectable levels in fish that are of concern, which we are, then it's coming right up the entire food web.
Great.
And the source being coming from land and flowing on surface waters to get into the ocean sediments. So some of these chemicals are so persistent that once they are released into sediment, into the ocean, it's the final sink for many of them, and they'll recycle for decades and decades. So that's why we are still finding fairly large amount of DDT in ocean sediments and ocean animals, because the half-life for the persistent metabolite of DDT, which is DDE, is about 70 years. So this is almost like geologic time we're looking at once the chemicals reach the oceans. And another thing we are quite concerned about.
And that was certainly one of the findings. And I think DDT is called a chlorinated hydrocarbon, if I'm wrong, but it's one of these ones that lasts for a long time, and it certainly caused a lot of trouble with bird shells and other animals reproducing. But I guess it comes to mind too that when we try to dredge our harbors in order to open them up for shipping, we're dredging up a lot of material. And any disturbance, like would dragging have that effect as well, of stirring the muck? Definitely,
absolutely. And it's releasing the toxics into the food web, and so you have like a mini flux of toxins with dredging, dragging, and any kind of disturbance, and storm action can do that too.
Right, and we're having more storms, so it's a perfect storm.
Violent storms, yeah.
So I want to remind listeners we've slipped past the halfway point on Common Health. We're talking today about healthy oceans and healthy communities with Dr. Susan Shaw, who is the Executive Director and President at the Marine Environmental Research Institute, and Dr. Jane Disney, who is with the Mount Desert Island Biological Lab. And I wanted to say she's the Director of the Community Environmental Health Laboratory. We welcome your calls, your questions and comments. You can call 469-0500, or you can call toll-free at 866-625-9378. Well, let's talk a little bit more about the other, problems. And I don't want to go too far out of your comfort zone, but something that has certainly come up in recent years is a bigger awareness of invasive species. And some of that may be happening because of the changes we're seeing in temperatures or in salinity. Mm-hmm. But a plague, and I don't know if either of you have looked into the red seaweed.
I haven't looked into it, but certainly I have gotten phone calls about it, and people have forwarded articles to me, and apparently it's making a big stinking mess down in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and I guess some places in southern Maine have begun to see it. I don't know what impact it could have on nearshore vegetative habitats, whether it can smother.
It does. Apparently, it can build up inches or even feet deep along beaches and cover everything.
It may have a big impact on our rocky intertidal and all of the seaweed in there, but also potentially on the nearshore eelgrass beds and that kind of thing. So it would be just a mess to see it here. One of the things we do have here that's causing more problems as water's warm is the green crab, and I've also received a lot of concerned calls from clammers and people interested in shellfish aquaculture because they can hardly get ahead of these guys, which will destroy soft-shell clams.
So the green crabs eat the clams when they're very young? I guess the fry, or I don't even know if you call them fry, but...
No, with the juvenile clams. Yep, and even adult clams they can destroy.
So I don't know if we have an answer for this, but why are the green crabs emerging now as a problem?
Well, they've been here for 100 years, and they're just more of a problem because there's more of them. Yeah, they've always been a competition for local crabs, and they've always been destructive to shellfish.
But something's happened now that's given them an advantage.
Yep. We don't have very cold winters now, and so they're not dying back, and their reproductive rates are up.
Okay, well, we do have another caller on the line, so if you give us your first name, where you're calling from, you can join our dialogue.
Hello, this is Carlton from Brooklyn. And I would just like to say I think this whole pollution thing is a conspiracy, and I think you liberals have your heads in the cloud. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Susan, you want to respond to that?
No, really. But, there are people that I think don't want to know that we're coming. Actually, what we're doing is coming from the science. So we're bringing science to public awareness. And this is not a happy message, and I think people, it's a rather overwhelming message, so there's a tendency to want to shrug it off, which this caller just did. But I totally understand that whole line of thinking, and there are people that think we are just simply stirring up trouble that doesn't exist. But if you're doing the tissue studies, it's like doing CSI work, and you're looking at these levels in tissue, then there's no argument about it. The levels are alarming. Some of the chemicals are increasing in tissue, and if it's increasing in, these are also increasing in human tissue. So, and the chemicals are now linked with many problems, not only in ocean animals but in people, like. Just to name a few, the brominated flame retardants that we're finding in human serum and human tissue are linked to reproductive problems, the loss of IQ in children that are exposed early on. It's now been linked to autism and to diabetes. So this is a serious issue, and it's not. It isn't a figment of imagination. It's about science.
Well, we do have another caller, and I probably want to thank Carlton for stirring the muck a little bit, too, and probably getting other people interested. Please remember, listeners, only one call at a time because Susan is on one of our two outside phone lines. But with that said, if our new caller would like to give us your first name and where you're calling from.
Hi, my name is Lucy, and I live in Troy. And I had a rude awakening this summer when I went to Bayside, where I frequent, outside of Northport. And I was going to take a dip in the water, and there was a sign posted that said, "No swimming when wastewater treatment alarm sounds." And I looked at my friend startled, and I was like, well, how do we know when it's going to sound, or how long does it sound for? And what does that really mean, and what is going on over here? And when I went home, I looked it up online, and I couldn't find very much information. But I did find some information that these are older wastewater treatment plants, and they're grandfathered into the way they can let their, whatever it is they have, all their treatment water out into the bays. And there's others of these in the state of Maine, and I was really concerned. I said, if it's not safe for swimming, what about any fish or shellfish or anything in the area. And it just was a rude awakening that things aren't safe here anymore. It's getting more like it is in Connecticut or Massachusetts.
Jane, we have these problems also with septic systems.
Right. Well, I want to say that overall in the state of Maine, we have pretty clean waters. We do have areas with sewage outfalls and areas with combined sewer overflows, as well as areas where we've got failed septic systems, and the Department of Marine Resources works on trying to identify areas of pollution and prohibit harvesting, say, of shellfish in areas where there are systems and where they've got something failing. These areas become restricted. So the DMR is always working on the public health end of things from a shellfish perspective, but we also have a Maine Healthy Beaches program in the state of Maine. We're a part of that program at the BioLab. And so there are swimming areas that are monitored all up and down the coast of Maine. And truly one of our biggest issues are heavy rainfalls that bring bacteria in through all kinds of non-point sources. And but overall, I think that between DMR and Maine Healthy Beaches, we're working on these things. I know DEP is interested in seeing some of these. What are they called? Not the combined sewer overflows, but
the overboard discharge systems.
The OBDs.
Where we didn't have enough dirt to do a septic field, they did these kind of treatment facilities that fail pretty readily and release biological waste at least. And Susan, this really gets at a point I think is important with toxics, is even if we are monitoring biological waste, little bits of toxic stuff seep out all the time, or people flush things down their toilets, household hazardous waste, and that introduces a lot. And then how do the bromated flame retardants get into the water?
Well, just exactly the same way. It's flowing through sewage. And one of the big secondary sources of brominated flame retardants getting into the water are wastewater treatment plants. So our caller was asking about some of these older plants and that are grandfathered in, and the overboard discharge systems that are around the coast are also most of those grandfathered in, and they're just guaranteed to seep out not just nutrients, but and waste, but also toxics. So another big source of say the flame retardants getting into the water would be our landfills, and landfills also leach out toxics, and that's been measured. So we can measure in the leachate, pretty significant levels of the brominated flame retardants, and those are going into the water as well.
So people throw their old couches and chairs, they get landfilled, crushed, and buried, but they're not stabilized enough, and so some of that material that's in the flame retardant, the flame retardant chemical, is actually just washing out of the landfill into the streams and down into the oceans.
Right, over time. The
landfill could go on for centuries.
Yeah, for centuries. And the landfill is only set up to last, it's estimated, from about 10 to 15 years before this starts happening. So many of our landfills are much older than that. But not just to be doom and gloom, I would say that what we are trying to do with at the Marine Environmental Research Institute is connect with people about this and give people information about what can you do with your couch if the flame retardants are right in the foam of any furniture, and they're also put into plastics that are in the home. So there are now companies that are not allowing flame retardants in those kinds of flame retardants in products, and it's important for people to know that. So when you buy a new couch, you have an option to get a couch without these materials.
It sounds like when we talk about either preventing something from getting into the waste stream or mitigating it once it's there, it sounds like we ought to be preventing some of these chemicals. Is that part of what you're doing?
That's part of what we're doing. It's a massive education program under Stop Toxic Ocean Pollution, And one of those is consumer action. Consumers can do a lot with the pocketbook in terms of, what we buy, but to do that, you have to know what these chemicals are, what the problem is with them, and then avoid buying products in your home and office that contain the chemicals.
Great. We have another caller on the line, so if you want to give us your first name and where you're calling from, we'd like to hear your question or comment.
Hi, this is Barbara, and I'm calling from Belfast.
You're on.
And I wondered if anybody was overseeing what's in Belfast Harbor. We used to sail in a boat, MDI, back in between 78 and 81, and the skipper would take all flammables because it was so filthy, and we'd have to haul the boat and clean it with straight Clorox. Now, I live in Belfast, and I love it, and it looks beautiful, but I don't dare to go swim in there yet. And I wanted to speak to the lady that talks about, boats discharging.
Right.
I used to work. I went to the boat school, and I worked boat maintenance for many, many years, and the small sailboats have to have holding tanks. But the big cruise ships can come in, and they can jettison tons a day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
I'm wondering why hasn't that changed? Because the little guy in the 35-footer is going to have his boat taken and everything if he's leaching anything.
Mm-hmm.
But I can remember in Bar Harbor, I think was it 72, we got all the laws for the sewage treatment plant. Because every spring they'd go down that little tiny town beach right off the pier, and we'd watch them raking. And I was in about the 6th grade, and we looked and went, my gosh, is that tampons, toilet paper, and the seaweed? And it was.
Yeah.
Wow. So, Jane, have you, I don't know if you've dealt with this, but certainly there's been a move to encourage more pump-out stations for boats and ways to avoid dumping. You can't help but notice the proliferation of Clorox bottles along Maine's beaches, and I assume that's from boats that are also cleaning equipment, cleaning traps, and just throwing the bottals overboard.
So the caller actually touched on a whole bunch of different topics there, and so I can talk to a few of them. Certainly, small boats need to go offshore to dump waste. It isn't okay for anyone to dump black water or sewage from their heads in a bay or right in the harbor. And hopefully you've got harbor masters, or you've got local harbor ordinances that are supporting that, but there's state law around that too. Pump out stations are really important to have, and some communities have them on boats that come around and pump out, and then others have them on docks and what have you. And I know Bar Harbor's looking at putting in an additional one at the end of the town pier to help boat owners make the right decision, encourage them to make the right decision. I know like down in Casco Bay, they've actually been designated an EPA no discharge zone, which is something else that people could look at, in terms of trying to create an atmosphere of no dumping. The large cruise ships are subject to Maine law. We have some good cruise ship legislation here in the state of Maine that prohibits any discharge of black water or gray water from large passenger vessels in particular. From smaller passenger vessels, the gray water is a little bit more loose. But people are working on these things. And so what Susan had alluded to earlier about legislation, I mean, that, you do need strong local and state level legislation to help mitigate the impacts of things like boats, large and small. And then what you talked about seeing on the beach, years ago, I saw that on the beach too in New Jersey back in the 1970s. But, Bar Harbor in particular, has a hugely upgraded sewer system since the one that they used to operate. I mean, DEP doesn't even like to see any CSOs anymore, the combined sewer overflows from sewage treatment plants that can't handle the load. So towns are being forced to deal with those too. And I think we're seeing even more upgrades. And I know in Bar Harbor, but so I think this is happening around the state. It has to. And these things we can address. We don't have to live with those kinds of pollutants coming into the water. And
could I ask one more question?
Okay.
Still on?
Yep.
Yeah. I wondered if the law had been changed, because I don't ever remember there being any allowing to say go out into international waters and dump your tank.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that when the law came in, there was no dumping it. You had to go and have it pumped out.
Okay, well, why don't we give you this answer over
I'll hang
the
up
radio, because we've only got one open line and we're getting close to time. Susan, do you want to add something? What about dumping in international waters?
Well, this is cruise ships are one of the major sources of pollution to the ocean. So it's very laudable what we're doing in Maine to keep coastal dumping from happening. But what's the problem is the international laws are not very uniform, and these cruise ships are just simply going up to the Bay of Fundy and dumping in the open ocean, tens of thousands of tons of waste, and in that waste you have toxics. So it's one of the things we are looking into, and I know that there are big improvements and innovations in an area like the Baltic, which is a semi-enclosed sea, and what they've done is create a lot of, hundreds of pump-out stations and facilities, receiving facilities around the Baltic Sea, which has become so toxic that you have these overgrown mats of algae floating around. And, the situation got so bad that they had to, and we're talking cruise ships. So in different areas of the world, there really important work is going on with this, but there's a need for an international, a global, coordinated effort. And one other thing I would say is we have a good poster child for this in the L.A. harbor. The Los Angeles harbor is an entirely green harbor, and they have special vehicles to go up to the cruise ships, and there are very, very tight regulations about what ships can come in and under what condition, and there are receiving facilities in that harbor. So progress is being made, but there's a lot of work to be done on the problem of ocean dumping.
Great. I'm going to squeeze in one more caller. I think we have someone on the line, and then we're going to be looking at wrapping up. But go ahead. You get the last word of the callers.
Hello, it's Yo. I wanted to reply to Carlton. I concur 100%. Pollution is a conspiracy. Toxifying the environment is just one more tactic that the corporate globalism uses to oppress and consolidate. The only intervention that's going to be effective is the dismantling of corporate globalism. Thanks again.
Not quite what I was expecting, but it was a way to turn Carlton's words around. Short of assigning a conspiracy motive, I think we do have a challenge, don't we, Susan, with the international regulations, and Jane, for that matter. Trying to deal with these problems locally is laudable, but some of these take a bigger vision, because the ocean sloshes everywhere.
Yeah. Okay. Well, what I would say to that is, I think the caller is correct to a certain extent that we have a corporate global economy that is operating as if pollution doesn't matter, and once you poison the ocean food web, then pollution does matter a lot, and you wreck economies. So there's an economic tie-in to this, and even in China, there's a lot of work going on to stop the air pollution that's raining down into the ocean. And the other thing to keep in mind is that legislation is moving forward even in this country, and we have on the table in the United States Senate now the Safe Chemicals Act of 2011 that's has been now passed in the Environment and Public Works Committee that's chaired by Senator Boxer, and this is the law that was sponsored by Frank Lautenberg, the Democrat from New Jersey. So the Safe Chemicals Act is the reform act for our outdated and very weak law that doesn't prevent us from toxic exposure in this country, the Toxic Substances Control Act of 76. And we've needed to reform that legislation for many, many years. If you look at it on a political, at the political spectrum, you can have a hopelessness, because there's such a strong lobby. The industry is spending millions of dollars to lobby to continue to produce toxic chemicals, without providing safety and health information, to produce chemicals that are protected in terms of their components by trade secrets. And these are loopholes in the current law that make it impossible for us to regulate toxic chemicals.
Well, I'm gonna give Jane another chance to talk, because we are about out of time. So, Jane, looking forward, what do you think are the next steps for your work with Frenchman Bay, Blue Hill Bay, and MDI Biological? And then, Susan, I want you to get in a word too.
Well, I still think that we've got to take a lot of this on at the local level, and I think that including young people and educators in the process will help to raise up a generation of people who are thinking not only locally but also globally. So on Frenchman Bay, we are very interested in taking matters into our own hands. Maybe we don't need laws. Maybe we can work out some things amongst ourselves, even as things stall in the legislature. And we're looking at area management, really, which is maybe the way to go. When people take care of what they have nearby, then they're vested in it, and they're going to take care of that place into the future.
How can people get involved?
With the Frenchman Bay Partners or with the Community Environmental Health Laboratory, you can give me a call at the MDI Biolab at 288-9880, extension 423. We have hundreds of volunteers every year that work with us across many of the issues I've talked about. And also, we are on the web at www.mdibl.org or FrenchmanBayPartners.org.
And Susan, if people want to get involved in what you're doing, do you have a way they can get in touch?
Absolutely. We're on our website is www.maryresearch.org, and you can also call the center in Blue Hill, 207-374-2135, and our email info@maryresearch.org.
Thank you so much. Well, we've come to the end of our program for this month. Be sure to visit our website, commonhealth.org, where you'll find helpful background on a variety of public health topics, including this one, including audio archives and a place for you to contribute questions for future shows. Common Health theme music is Picabia, performed by Eric Horshak. Thanks to our guests today, Dr. Susan Shaw and Dr. Jane Disney. Thanks to Amy Brown for engineering, and to our underwriters and members for supporting all of our public affairs and news programs. Common Health airs the third Wednesday of the month from 10 to 11 with support from the Hancock County Planning Commission and Healthy Acadia, a Healthy Maine partnership serving Hancock County. Join us on January 17th in 2013 for a dialogue about safe, healthy, and warm homes in the depth of winter. Healthy Acadia has launched a new initiative to promote cleaner indoor environments, and you'll have a chance to share your ideas. Thanks for listening and for your suggestions for future programs. Email us at commonhealth@weru.org and stay tuned for On the Wing. This is Jim Fisher wishing you good health.